welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. This is Jessica. I am your host. I am here with author Katherine Adams. And we are here to talk about her book, Tonight I Burn, which is so good. I loved it so much. I've been telling everybody they need to read it. And I can't wait for the next one. So please talk a little bit about where the idea for this story came from, because it's such a great world. I loved all the characters. I really felt immersed in it when I started reading it.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. And I'm so glad you enjoyed the book. The idea for Tonight I Burn actually came when I was in the middle of writing another story. So I was kind of nearly at the end of a draft of a book, and I read an interview online with the author of I'm Faye, who said she was thinking up an idea for her next book, and her agent suggested taking a trope and flipping it. And the idea kind of played in my mind for quite a while, I think. And then I suddenly thought, witches don't like being burnt. So what if the witches are burning themselves? And then the first 3 lines hit me, and I was like, no, I'm going to write them down and go back to this other story. But they just wouldn't get out of my head. So I wrote the first chapter and sent it to my friend, and she sent back, you have to keep writing this. And the rest of it just fell out over 2 weeks on my iPad. It's changed a bit since then, quite a lot since then, but it just fell out and wrote itself, this one. And it kind of grew around Penny, the main character, and her relationship with her sister. And yeah, it's probably my favorite thing I've ever written. I love this story so much.
I loved it too. And like I said, it was definitely a world that I really loved being immersed in. And one of the most fun things I ever hear is when an author basically tells me that the story just had to fall out, that it wrote itself. So the world that Penny lives in, she is a thorn witch, and there's different covens, and they're all kind of kept apart from each other. And there's sort of this leader called the warden, who's, you know, mysterious but lords over everything, and you immediately get the sense that all is not right with the warden, but people are following along with what they're supposed to be doing because this is what you do. And as you mentioned, burning is part of it. So you find out immediately that thorn witches are supposed to walk in death as well, and in order to do that, they need to burn. But they come back. They get better.
Yeah.
To quote Monty Python. But it is such an intriguing idea. And you do have Penny, who is the main character, and she has her 2 sisters. There's Mila, who's older, and then there's Ella, which is short for Isabella. And she's the sort of the one who kind of draws Penny into all of this. There's such a winding story of intrigue and just different paths that she follows. You say the story wrote itself. How did that work? Like, did you just sort of immerse yourself in this world the way that it felt like to read the story?
Yeah, so the world kind of grew around the story. And one of the things I wanted to do when I was writing it was keep Penny's world quite small, especially at the beginning, because she's bound by all these rules and she's not able to do anything, and she doesn't really see anything outside of her real closeted existence. And then as her world gets bigger, the story kind of just follows the path she takes. So as I was writing, I kind of write to entertain myself. So if I get bored, I'll throw something really random in there. And then when I go back to editing, that's when it all kind of makes sense. So I'm kind of the sort of writer that would I take my story and shovel all the sand into the sandbox in the first draft, and then I go back and make it look pretty afterwards. So quite a lot of stuff hit the cutting room floor. Plot lines were pulled out, and other ones that I really liked were kind of elaborated on. One of the things I really built on in editing was the relationship with Penny's sisters. So I absolutely adore those sister relationships that are going on. So I added lots of extra scenes to kind of bring that to the front and center of it.
The sister relationships were really nice, but it wasn't just the sister relationships. There's also the mysterious relationship between Penny and her grandmother, who is a really interesting character to read. You said everything started with Penny. Did the rest of the characters sort of start to flesh themselves out as you kind of walked around through Penny's eyes and saw who they were?
Yeah, Penny's grandma was actually a lot meaner in the first draft. So she developed more. And as one of the things I really like doing as I'm writing is I love side characters, which is it's really fun, but it's also a bit of a curse because I have to cut things out, otherwise it gets too convoluted. But so as I fleshed out the backstory of Penny's grandma in my head, like her character really solidified. So I've got lots of little stories kind of off to the side in files that are, note down the other characters' lives. So yeah, Grandma Witch kind of definitely fleshed out as I wrote, and I kind of knew who she was by the end of the story. But yeah, she really came to life in the edits as well.
So one other thing that I adored about this story is that aside from the fact that it's just a really nicely built world, you also kind of go back and there's fairy tales that exist within the pages, which it's one of my favorite, I guess. I don't want to necessarily call it a trope, but I guess it kind of is. It's one of my favorite things that a fantasy writer does, because what I love about fairy tales as a fairy tale person myself is I feel like they're a really great way to inform the world that you are writing about. And fairy tales can be unreliable narrators in
Yeah,
themselves.
absolutely.
And it's fun because when you read a story that has lore, but not just the lore that's part of the story, lore as it's being explained by somebody else or has been kind of interpreted by somebody else, it just sort of makes for a better mystery because you know that while there's probably a seed of truth in there, it's not 100% as things are. Um, did you have a favorite story that you put in there, and was it kind of difficult for you to decide, like were there any fairy tales that did not make the cutting room floor that might make the next book?
So I really love Greek mythology, and I love looking at the way Greek mythology has been told by traditionally male viewpoints. And I like how you can look in between the words and the lines and see the like the females that are kind of missing from the stories and the impact they had on the world. And I really love how fairy tales do the same kind of thing. And when you read the stories that were told, especially like, the real historical ones, like the Grimm's ones, you can see the morals of the world and everything that's going on through the eyes of the person that told the story. So I really enjoyed playing with that. And yet, I mean, there's lots of fairy tales that didn't make the book that I've got kind of tucked away. And there's definitely going to be some more in the next story. I haven't quite decided which ones yet. But I mean, there is a thread of truth that runs through those fairy tales, and that's got quite a big impact later on in the story and like in the arc of the trilogy. So yeah, I don't want to say too much because I don't want to ruin it, but I absolutely, the fairy tales is one of my favorite things. And actually when I was doing the first draft, the story of the can't remember what it's called in the book, it's the one with the boy and the sorcerer in the woods. So that was the first one I wrote, and that one fell out in this really, really fast first draft. And I went back, and then you can kind of apply that to different threads running through the story and how that impacts different characters and their actions.
Yeah, definitely. I liked that. And I have to say, as a librarian, I am a fan of the book sprites.
I love the book sprites. They are my absolute favorite. Have you seen the art that I've got of those?
I have not actually.
Have you not? I've got that. It's on my Instagram, and there's
I'm gonna have to look that up and actually Now yeah, I'm gonna look that up. That's I need to see that now. Oh my goodness. How did they come around?
Um, I think I was just having fun, is the honest answer. But I just kind of I wanted something a bit more fun. It's a really dark story, and there's quite a lot of dark threads, and like there's moments of hope and there's moments of light, and there's humor in it as well. But the book sprites were just purely fun when I first came up with them, and I really enjoyed playing with them. Um, they thread into it a lot more through the rest of the trilogy as well. They're in it a bit more in book two, actually. But I adore them. They're yeah, they kind of remind me of my children, actually. They do things like move bookmarks around my books.
Yeah,
So
that
yeah.
was super fun. I really loved that. That was like super fun to read. I don't know. I kind of wish we had them for real.
Yes, so do I. And especially if I could actually shelve and organize your books neatly and tell people off for like dog earing corners and stuff like that, you know?
Yes, for sure. That would actually be extremely helpful. Now that I think about it that way. Um, so you also have some really great side characters. Do you have a favorite? I know I have a
I
few.
do. I
Who's your
do.
favorite?
Tobias. I love Tobias. He's my absolute favorite. And Claire, but Tobias and I love them all, could you tell?
Yeah,
And
no, for
Beatrice.
sure.
So Beatrice is one of my absolute favorites. And Tobias is my top. He's my number one. I adore him, and I love the relationship he builds with Penny, and I love the relationship he has with Ella as well. And I like how he's kind of all torn apart, and but he's just so nice, you know. He's like a cinnamon roll.
He is. He was definitely one of my favorites too. I also have to say I really enjoyed reading Alice.
Oh, I love Alice. Yeah, I mean Alice and Malin. I mean, I love both of them, but Alice is my baby. She's like, yeah,
I liked just sort of how she sort of unfolded, and this is kind of adding to the intrigue of it for, for readers. Alice is the spinner, and she's considered to be almost like completely beholden to the warden. And you find out, I mean, it's not really a spoiler. You find out that she, her name, and there's more about names in the story, which I love. But you find out pretty much from the first page that she's doing something that she probably shouldn't be doing and
yeah,
giving Penny information that she shouldn't be giving her. And from there, she just becomes just this extremely interesting character. Now, Tobias is really interesting. Do you want to talk a little bit just about, do you want to talk a little bit about the Gilded? Because I thought that they were a nice touch to the story as well.
yeah. So the Gilded are completely under the warden's control. They don't have any say in what they do. They don't really have any thoughts. They're just pretty unpleasant, really. But they also don't have any say in becoming gilded. So I quite like tying the magic system into the metal and then using all the different kinds of magic that are in the world to subjugate their own people almost. Because like one of the problems I kind of hit was how do I have this guy who doesn't seem to have any magic controlling all these magical people? So that was kind of where the gilding came into play. And I don't want to say anything that's a spoiler, but I mean Tobias is gilded and he's found a way to avoid the like slip under the radar and avoid that mind control. So he's actually kind of a bit of a double agent, you know, and he's so torn between doing what he has to do and doing some of the real hard stuff to protect the people that he loves, and sometimes he has to do some really 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 unpleasant things, but his heart's in the right place all the way through.
I really just enjoyed the story as a whole. It was just a really wonderful world to dip into. Have you always been a fantasy reader?
I have, yeah. So I've always been a reader since I was about 3, and I told my mum, who's a school teacher, that I didn't need her to teach me to read because I could already do it. And I used to recite all the words out of my Postman Pat books. Um, and then when I was 7, my mum gave me a copy of The Hobbit, and that was it. I was hooked. And the world of The Hobbit is just so vivid in my head. I can still see it like pictures. So I just kind of fell down this fantasy hole at 8, and I've not really come out of it. I mean, I've gone through stages of reading other things. I did the rom-com thing for a while, and I mean, those are so fun. I like dipping into those sometimes. And thriller and horror. I got really hooked on horror when I was a teenager. So I went through Stephen King's, and there was point horror books when I was a teenager. I don't know if they still have those, but yeah. So yeah, but fantasy is my number one. I've read a lot of fantasy books, obviously. And then I also really like Margaret Atwood. She's like one of my favorite authors. I love her prose. And I think it was reading Margaret Atwood that actually shaped my writing. I love how she uses words, and how the words she uses the sound of the words kind of adds to the story. If you read it out loud, they kind of sound like what she's saying. And that's one of the things that I really try to do when I'm writing.
You can see the threads of horror in there. What is sort of informed by horror. And I think that dark fantasy, just in general, I don't know, I like it because you kind of have a little bit of all worlds in it.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I love how, like, with the darkness, it kind of almost buries you in the book deeper. And the stakes are so much higher. And some of the characters that you end up with, these characters that are so morally grey that they can't just make good decisions, because there's no good decisions to be had. So everyone's just a bit questionable. Like, well, one of the characters that I like best is Myla. Well, I like all of them, but we've established that. But Myla, she's kind of this real questionable character going through the book, and I had a lot of fun with her, like thinking about how mysteries and thrillers are written and the characters in those.
Yeah, I liked her too. I thought she was really interesting. I wasn't really sure 100% what she was about in the beginning. I think I called her Mila in the beginning of this interview, and I apologize. It's Mila.
Oh, that's okay.
So do you come from a very close family? Do you have sisters yourself? Because their relationship just felt so real.
I don't have a sister, no. I've got a brother, but when we grew up, we were really close. So we traveled around quite a lot. My dad's used to be in flight test engineering. So we traveled to Canada and lived there for a year. And then we drove from one side of Canada to the other. So a lot of my childhood, like, my only stable friend was my brother. I had other friends, but they kind of came and went as we moved. So yeah, I mean, there are definitely aspects of the relationship with my brother, that sibling kind of banter and the rivalry a little bit, and the trust you have in them as well, and the fact that you would do anything for them. So all of that kind of came into it. And I used that to shape the relationships. But I actually had quite a lot of help with especially transferring that to a sister relationship with my editor. She's got a sister, and she was like, well, if my sister did this. So I was like, okay, right, we need to rethink this. So I kind of had to jump out of my own head and into Penny's a little bit with that. But yeah, definitely we were really close. We used to spend all our holidays on a boat just around the south coast of England, and so we'd be like weeks on end not speaking to anybody other than the four of us. So yeah, they've all actually moved out to New Zealand. I moved out here in 2008, and they came out, my brother came out a couple of years later, and then my mum and dad came out a couple of years after that. So I've moved the whole lot of us 12,000 miles away from home.
So one more thing I wanted to ask, how did you come up with the different covens of witches and just sort of what they would be about?
Well, that's a tricky one. They just kind of fell into place, really. I think I started off with, in the first draft, we just had the Thorn Witches, and then I kind of had these nebulous other witches around, and then as I kind of developed the world more, I wanted everything to be a bit more specific, obviously. And I kind of wanted to go with the elements, but I just wanted to twist it a little bit. And I quite like how the others are linked to the 4 elements. But the Thorn Witches aren't really, like, death's kind of its own element. So yeah, I wanted something that kind of set the other witches apart from what Penny and her coven are doing, but also was kind of familiar to fantasy, just with a little bit of a twist on there. So yeah, we got the storm witches who manage all the crops and the weather systems and keep the planet kind of fertile, or the world fertile, and the harvests going. And then we've got the all witches and the ember witches and the tide witches. So yeah, all linked to the element.
Do you have any recommendations, maybe like read-alikes or watch-alikes, while we're waiting for the next installment of this series?
Oh gosh, that's putting me on the spot. Lani Taylor's Strange the Dreamer, I adore that. Her prose is gorgeous. Her storytelling is just magnificent. And so yeah, I mean, that the Strange the Dreamer duology, definitely. I really like Girls of Paper and Fire. I like the relationship building and the world building in that. That's amazing. Erin Craig, House of Salt and Sorrow. That's amazing. That's got those horror elements and the fairy tale elements in as well. I love that book. And I mean, obviously, anything by any of the other dark fantasy, powerhouses, Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros. The Year of the Flood by Margaret Atwood's amazing. Most people have read like The Handmaid's Tale and that, but some of her other stuff. There's one I can't pronounce. It's Oinks and Crake. That is fabulous. That's because that's got those fantasy kind of post-apocalyptic kind of themes running through it, but anything by her. And Garth Nix, there we go. I want to roll now.
Garth Nix is great. I love Garth Nix's books so much.
I have got special editions. Like, I don't have a lot of like special editions, but I've got like 3 different copies of his Stabriel. That's one of my favorite books of all time. So yeah, that's great. Anything by him is fabulous. I actually got my daughter reading the Ragdoll when she was it the Ragdoll when she was quite little. She loves that. And Rochelle Mead as well. Her Vampire Academy series is brilliant, but she's got a couple. I think it's Soundless, which is brilliant. I think it's about a village of people who can't hear, and there's one, yeah. So that's really, really brilliant. The world building in that is brilliant.
So I guess one more question, and maybe this is like one that's more of a beginning question. How did you get into writing?
I mean, the short version is that my husband's got to get it. So the short answer is that I've always written. I wrote my first book when I was 4. And then I wrote another one when I was about 8 for my little brother who was struggling to read. So I wrote one for him and I drew pictures. And then when I was about 10, I wanted a typewriter, begged for a typewriter, and I tapped out stories for years. And then I went to uni and kind of life got in the way. And then I picked it up again a couple of years ago. So now we're getting into the long version. We had a couple of traumatic incidents in the family, and I was struggling with that and my children going off to school and not needing me so much anymore, and I needed to do something. So I sat down and I got my daughter's old maths book and I plotted out this world and this story and these characters, not this one, and then I sat and I wrote the whole thing down. It took me about 6 weeks, and I was so proud of myself that I had this 80,000 word manuscript, and it was amazing, and I was going to get published, and it was the best thing anyone had ever written. And I will be forever grateful for the 3 people who read that horrible story and told me it didn't suck and that it was great. And then I kind of realized just how hard it was and how much I sucked, and I set out to learn how to do it properly. And I went from writing in a maths book to my husband building me an office, and then I wrote 6 stories back to back. And in between each story, I'd go back to that first one and rewrite it. And now then Penny fell out my head. And all of those things that I learned through the many, many stories kind of, fell out into Penny. And here we are. It was all a bit of a shock, to be honest with you, because at the beginning, I was like, oh, this is going to be easy. I'm going to write this book and it's going to get published and everyone's going to love it. And yeah, I read it the other day, actually. I read a couple of pages of it for something and I was just like, oh my God, how did I inflict this on people? But and then I went through the whole, actually this is really, really hard. This is quite a mountain. You need to find an agent and this, that, and the other. And but But it was very, very healing, writing those first stories and actually having something for me instead of something that was for the family. And I've had a lot of support from especially my immediate family. My daughter, she's just 13 and she beta reads to me now. So anything, if I'm not sure of something, I'll give it to her, and she's brutal. She'll tell me if something doesn't work. But I do put post-it notes on some of the pages so she can't read those. The naughty bits, we don't want to share those.
Well, thank you so much. This was really great. I was very happy to read this, and I can't wait for the next one. Does it have a title? Are you allowed to say?
Yeah, so it's called Tonight I Bleed.
Ooh, nice.
It is with my editor at the moment, and I absolutely love it. I really, really love what happens in it, and I'm really excited to write number 3, which is kind of just about to kind of start falling out onto the page. Yeah, lots of things happen in book 2.
Thank you so much, Katherine J. Adams. Check out Tonight I Burn. It is already in bookstores and libraries, and you should absolutely be reading it. And I can't wait for Tonight I Bleed. Hopefully, I'll get to talk to you about that one.
I'd love it. I'd really love to talk to you again. That would be so much fun. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so pleased you enjoyed the book.
I did. Thank you. So once again, this is Jessica with Turn the Page Podcast, and we are going to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.